The planet of Zaxareth was a battlefield ravaged by endless war. It was a world torn apart by the unyielding conflict between the Zaxian Empire and the Human Federation, where both sides fought fiercely for control of the valuable resources that lay buried beneath the barren surface. The air was thick with the smoke of burning structures and the cries of soldiers who had given everything for their cause. And in the heart of this chaos, amidst the twisted metal and debris, Lyriketh lay broken on the ground. She was a half-mutant, half-Zaxian warrior caught in the middle of a conflict that never seemed to end. Her body was covered in burns from the explosion that had sent her crashing to the ground, her alien features blending with her human ones in a way that made her an outcast on both sides. Her Zaxian comrades did not accept her because of the human blood running through her veins, and the humans saw her as nothing more than a monstrous enemy. The war had given her nothing but hatred and rejection. Her vision blurred as she fought to stay conscious. The pain in her body was overwhelming, but it was the loneliness that was even worse. She had always been different, and because of that she had never felt like she belonged. She had fought in battles for the Zaxian Empire because it was the only place where she could find a sense of purpose, even if it meant sacrificing herself again and again. Yet now, as she lay there wounded and abandoned, she couldn't help but question it all. Was this all? She was destined for a life of pain and rejection. The sounds of gunfire and shouting filled the air, but no one came to help. No one even looked her way. She was invisible to both sides. They saw only her mutancy and the threat she represented, not the person she had once been, not the woman who had dreamed of a different future, one where she could live in peace, where the violence would cease and the hatred would finally end. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Lyriketh struggled to hold onto her fading consciousness. She could feel her strength draining away with each passing second. Her body ached from the wounds, but what hurt the most was the realization that she had been left to die here alone. There was no one who cared, no one who would mourn her passing, and in that moment something inside her shattered. She had never asked to be this way. She had never chosen to be different, yet here she was fighting for a cause that rejected her. Her eyes fluttered as the darkness began to close in on her. Just as she was about to give in to the cold embrace of unconsciousness, she heard footsteps approaching. They were slow, cautious, almost as if whoever it was unsure whether to approach or turn away. At first, she thought it might be another soldier come to finish her off, but when she saw the figure step into view, she was shocked. It was a human, a medic. She could tell by the markings on his uniform. He knelt down beside her, carefully assessing her injuries with a professional eye, as if he had done this 1,000 times before, and yet his gaze was not filled with contempt or fear. It was filled with something else, something she hadn't seen in a long time, something almost like kindness. Her breath hitched in her chest as she tried to speak, but only a weak rasp escaped her lips. The medic didn't flinch. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder reassuringly and whispered softly, "I'm here, you're going to be all right." And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Lyriketh allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for her to survive. Jason Tiller knelt beside the half-mutant alien woman, his combat medic instincts kicking in as he quickly assessed the damage. Her breathing was shallow, her body battered by the explosion, and yet there was something strangely familiar in her face, something that made him pause. Her eyes, though bloodshot and clouded with pain, held a depth he hadn't expected to find in a Zaxian warrior. She wasn't just an enemy or a casualty. She was a person, someone who had suffered in ways Jason couldn't yet comprehend. His fingers moved swiftly, checking her pulse, her limbs, and the deep gashes that ran across her chest. He muttered under his breath as he dug into his first aid kit, pulling out bandages and a healing agent, trying to steady his hands. The medic's training had taught him how to stabilize and save lives in the most extreme circumstances, but this was different. This wasn't just a random soldier or an anonymous face. This was a half-mutant Zaxian woman, a being who didn't fit into any simple category of enemy or ally. And despite everything, despite the endless hatred between their peoples, Jason couldn't bring himself to leave her behind. As he worked, she stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. Her gaze met his, and Jason felt a chill run through him. She looked at him with distrust at first, as if trying to decipher his intentions. But her expression softened just a fraction, and he could see the flicker of something, a fear perhaps, or maybe just resignation. He couldn't be sure. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a rasping cough. Jason quickly reached for a small vial of water, tilting it gently to her lips. She drank greedily, her parched throat gratefully accepting the relief. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of the war around them forgotten in the quiet exchange. "You're a medic," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" Jason paused. He had heard this question before, many times, but never from someone in her position. The Zaxians saw him as nothing more than a tool of war, just another soldier fighting for the other side. But he wasn't like the others. He wasn't fighting for conquest. He wasn't driven by the same hatred that consumed so many of them. His purpose was clear, even if it seemed trivial in the grand scheme of things: to save lives, no matter whose they were. "Because everyone deserves a chance," Jason said quietly, his voice steady. "You're hurt, and I'm here to help you, not because you're an enemy, but because you're a person." She blinked, confused. It was clear she hadn't expected that answer. No one had ever shown her kindness, not in this way. To the Zaxians, she was a hybrid, a product of a forbidden union. To the humans, she was a threat, a beast to be destroyed. Jason's words were like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in a sea of rejection. And yet, something deep inside her resisted. Could she trust him? Could she trust a human? Jason didn't wait for a response. He focused on her wounds, continuing to clean and stitch the gashes on her side. He worked efficiently, but his mind kept wandering back to that moment when their eyes met. She wasn't just another casualty of war. She was someone who had suffered, just like him. Someone who had been caught in the crossfire of a conflict that neither of them had chosen. As the minutes passed, Lyraketh's breathing became steadier. Her wounds, though severe, were starting to stabilize. Jason's hands, though worn and tired, never faltered. In that moment, amidst the violence and chaos surrounding them, they found an unspoken understanding. Two souls, divided by war, but united by the simple act of saving a life. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a little stronger now. I thought no one would care." Jason's heart tightened at her words. It's not about caring for sides. It's about caring for people. As Lyraketh drifted into a deeper, more peaceful sleep, Jason leaned back, taking a breath. He didn't know what this woman's future held, or what role she would play in the larger conflict. But one thing was clear. In that brief moment of contact, they had crossed a line. They were no longer simply soldier and enemy. Something had changed. And as the war raged on around them, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the moment that defined everything. As the days passed, Lyraketh's condition improved, though not without setbacks. Jason tended to her wounds with careful precision, watching over her like a guardian. Each time she stirred, each time her eyes flickered open, there was an unspoken tension between them, a mixture of uncertainty and understanding. She would look at him with suspicion, as if waiting for him to betray her, yet there was also a quiet gratitude in her gaze. Jason had saved her life, and in a world built on distrust and hatred, that alone seemed like an impossibility. Their time together was mostly silent. Lyraketh would rest, and Jason would focus on his work, patching up her injuries, checking her vitals, and keeping watch for any signs of enemy movement. It wasn't until the third day that Lyraketh spoke again, her voice still weak but steadier now. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her tone more curious than hostile. Her eyes were still guarded, but there was something more to them now. She was beginning to open up, even if just a little. Jason didn't answer immediately. He set down his medkit, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The answer to her question wasn't simple. It wasn't something that could be explained with a few words. His motives were far from clear, even to himself. But there was something about her, something that defied the narratives of enemy and ally that had been drilled into him. "I don't see you as the enemy," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "I see you as a person. You're hurt. You need help. So I'm here to give it." Lyrakith's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him as though she was trying to figure him out. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Jason could almost feel the walls she had built around herself, the defenses that had been reinforced over years of pain and rejection. To her, trust was a currency she couldn't afford, and kindness was something she hadn't known in a long time. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" she asked, her voice tinged with something vulnerable, something raw. "Aren't you terrified of what I am? Of what I could do?" Jason met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I've seen fear. I've seen real terror in this war. But it's not the kind of fear I feel for you. I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of what this war is doing to all of us. We're all just trying to survive. But survival doesn't have to mean becoming monsters." Lyrakith's gaze softened for the briefest of moments, and for the first time, she looked away. There was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, a mixture of sadness and longing, as if she had heard those words before, but had never truly believed them. "I wasn't born a warrior," she said softly, almost to herself. "I didn't ask for this, but it's all I've known. It's the only way I've survived." Jason was silent for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. He understood all too well. Survival wasn't always about choice. It was about doing what you had to, even if it meant becoming something you didn't recognize. It was about making it through each day, no matter the cost. "You don't have to keep fighting," he said, his voice gentle but sincere. "Not all battles are physical. There's more to you than this war. You don't have to be a weapon. You can choose a different path." Lyrakith shook her head slowly, as if the idea seemed impossible. "And what path is that?" "A path of peace, of forgiveness. Do you really believe that's possible for someone like me?" Jason didn't respond right away. Instead, he met her gaze steadily, his expression unwavering. "I believe it's possible for anyone, even you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of possibility. There was something fragile in that moment, something that felt like it could either shatter or bloom into something new. And for the first time, Lyrakith felt the faint stirrings of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the cycle of violence she had been trapped in for so long. As the sun began to set over the war-torn landscape, Jason and Lyrakith sat in silence. They were two people from worlds that had always been at odds, brought together by nothing more than circumstance, and the simple act of one human medic choosing to save the life of a half-mutant alien woman. Neither knew what the future held, but in that moment, they shared something more powerful than any weapon could offer: a chance at understanding, and perhaps even peace. Days turned into weeks, and as Jason and Lyrakith moved deeper into the rugged wilderness of Zaxareth, their situation grew more desperate. The war had not paused for them, and the Zaxian assassins were closing in. Jason had seen how the world worked. Once a target was identified, there was no escaping the hunt. But with each passing hour, as he and Lyrakith grew closer, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the war itself was a battle he couldn't win. It was the battle for humanity's soul, one that had been lost long before he had ever picked up a weapon. Lyrakith had grown stronger with each passing day, her wounds healing as her body adapted to the care she was receiving. But there was something else happening inside her, a shift that Jason couldn't quite understand. She was becoming more than just a person to him. She was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the war, everything that both sides had tried to erase. Yet she had survived. And in her survival, Jason saw a glimmer of hope, hope that maybe they could make a difference. "Why are you still helping me?" Lyrakith asked one evening, her voice cutting through the silence. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the distant mountains, and the air felt heavy with the promise of an incoming storm. Jason didn't look at her immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes trained on the horizon, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "Because I believe in something more than just this war," he said finally. "More than just the hatred and the fighting. There has to be more to us than that." Lyra Kith was silent for a moment, processing his words. She had never thought about it that way before. To her, survival had always been about power, about proving her worth, about being something that others feared and respected. But Jason's words were like a crack in the wall she had built around herself. He wasn't asking her to be a weapon or a tool. He was asking her to be something else, to be human. "Do you think peace is possible?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with doubt. Jason turned to face her now, his expression serious but filled with conviction. "I think it has to be. Otherwise, what's the point of all this?" Lyra Kith's eyes searched his face, trying to understand him, trying to figure out why he was different from all the others. "You're not like the others," she said softly. "Why aren't you afraid of me? Or of what I am?" Jason smiled faintly, his gaze never wavering. "Because I've seen enough of fear to know it's not the answer. Fear makes us do things we regret. It's not who we are. It's just how we react when we feel threatened." She stared at him for a long time, contemplating his words. The fear that had driven her actions, the fear that had shaped her existence, was slowly starting to crumble. But it wasn't easy. The war had burned into her very soul, and trust didn't come naturally. Still, something in her began to soften. A tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, peace was not an impossible dream. Just then, the sound of footsteps reached their ears. Jason's hand immediately went to his sidearm, his body tense as he scanned the surroundings. Lyra Kith stood up quickly, her senses heightened, the old instincts kicking in. They weren't alone. A group of Zaxian soldiers emerged from the tree line, their weapons drawn, their eyes hard. It was the assassins, the ones who had been hunting them since they first fled the battlefield. Jason's heart raced as he pulled Lyra Kith behind him, his thoughts racing. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. They were cornered. The Zaxian commander, a tall figure in dark armor, stepped forward. "You cannot escape your fate, half-breed," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "The Empire will have you back, whether you want it or not." Lyra Kith's body tensed, the rage building inside her. Jason knew that look. He had seen it before in soldiers who had nothing left to lose. But he also knew the stakes. There was no room for violence here. Not if they wanted to survive. Not if they wanted to change anything. "Listen to me," Jason said urgently, his voice steady but desperate. "This war isn't going to solve anything. We don't have to keep fighting." The commander laughed, a cold, guttural sound. "You think a human can stop the will of the Zaxian Empire? You're a fool." Lyra Kith's hand instinctively went to the weapon at her side, but Jason grabbed her arm. "Not like this. Not now." She looked at him, a flash of confusion and conflict in her eyes. But something about his words reached her. She hesitated. "Please," Jason urged. "We don't have to be enemies." The tension in the air was thick, the seconds stretching into eternity. And then, with a sudden movement, Lyra Kith's weapon dropped to the ground. She stepped back from the commander, her voice low but firm. "I'm done fighting," she said, her words cutting through the chaos like a knife. For a moment, there was stunned silence. The Zaxian soldiers stood frozen, their weapons still raised, their eyes locked on Lyra Kith. They were not accustomed to seeing one of their own surrender, especially one as formidable as her. She had been a symbol of their strength, a weapon of the Empire's will, and now she was walking away from it all. Her decision had sent ripples through the group, challenging everything they had been taught to believe. Jason, still tense, kept his hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that he would protect her no matter what. His gaze never left the Zaxian commander, who had yet to speak. There was a flicker of disbelief in the commander's eyes, followed by a flash of anger. "You disgrace the Empire," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You choose a traitor's path, and you will be treated as one." Lyraketh's chest heaved with the weight of her decision, but she didn't back down. "I am no longer a soldier of the Empire," she said firmly. "I will not be part of this endless cycle of bloodshed. I've seen enough, and I choose something else. I choose peace." Jason could feel her tension, the struggle within her. She was speaking words that felt like a new language to her, words she hadn't believed in until now. He had seen it in her before, her belief that war was all she knew. But now there was a growing fire in her that rejected that path, and he couldn't help but feel proud of her courage. The commander's expression twisted in fury. "You think you can walk away from this? From everything we've built? You are nothing but a half-breed. You belong nowhere. No side will accept you." Jason stepped forward, his body blocking Lyraketh's as he stared down the commander. "She belongs here. She belongs with us, away from the bloodshed you've created. And if you try to take her back, you'll have to go through me." The commander's eyes darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like he would give the order to attack. But then, something changed in his demeanor. He studied Jason, then glanced at Lyraketh, as though weighing the worth of his actions. Finally, with a grimace, he motioned for his soldiers to lower their weapons. "This is not over," the commander growled, his words like a threat hanging in the air. "You will regret this decision." With a sharp, dismissive gesture, the group of Zaxian soldiers turned and began to retreat, the commander's gaze lingering on Lyraketh for a moment longer before he disappeared into the trees. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, but the gravity of the situation still weighed heavily on Jason and Lyraketh. Their lives were far from safe, and now they had made themselves targets of both the Zaxian Empire and the human forces who would see her as a traitor. Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and turned to face Lyraketh. Her expression was one of exhaustion, as though she had just fought the hardest battle of her life. Because in many ways, she had. "You did the right thing," Jason said softly, his voice filled with an unspoken respect. "You've made a choice that others won't understand, but it's yours. And that matters more than anything." Lyraketh nodded slowly, though her gaze was distant. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted quietly. "I don't know if I can ever truly escape the past. The war, it's inside me. It's part of who I am." Jason stepped closer, his hand resting on her arm. "You don't have to carry it alone. You've already made the hardest choice. Now it's time to find what's next, together." Lyraketh looked at him, a flicker of something deep in her eyes, perhaps the beginnings of trust. She had always believed that people like her didn't deserve peace, that her place in the world had already been decided by the blood of war. But here, now, standing beside a human who had shown her kindness, she began to wonder if there was another path she could take. "We'll find it," Jason said, his tone more of a promise than a question. "We'll find a way." As they turned away from the battlefield and began to move deeper into the wilderness, there was no map, no clear path ahead. But for the first time in a long while, both of them felt the weight of the world shift just a little. They were no longer enemies. They were two individuals, seeking something that had eluded them for so long: redemption, and perhaps a future free from the chaos of war. And in that quiet moment, amidst the ruins of a broken world, they dared to dream of peace. The days following the Zaxian encounter were filled with uncertainty. Jason and Lyraketh moved cautiously, staying off the beaten paths and using the dense forests and jagged cliffs as cover. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, much like the world they now inhabited. They couldn't afford to be careless. The Empire would send more assassins. They'd have to keep moving, keep surviving. And, if they were lucky, keep each other alive. But even amidst the uncertainty, there was a quiet bond beginning to form between them, a fragile connection born out of shared danger and mutual understanding. They spoke little, but when they did, their conversations were no longer about the war or their pasts. They spoke of small things: the way the forest smelled after a rainstorm, the beauty of a distant sunset, the hope that perhaps somewhere a peaceful life still existed beyond the chaos. It was on the fourth day, as they navigated through a thick part of the forest, that Jason noticed the change. Lyraketh, once reserved and guarded, seemed to be letting her walls fall, piece by piece. Her eyes no longer held the same hardened edge of distrust. She was quieter now, not out of fear, but because she had begun to allow herself the space to heal, to think beyond the fight. "Do you ever wonder what we'd do if the war ended?" Lyraketh asked one evening, her voice softer than usual. The fire between them crackled, and the shadows of the trees seemed to whisper around them. Jason looked up from the fire, meeting her gaze. Her question was unexpected. They hadn't spoken much about what would happen if they survived, if they found some semblance of peace. It felt almost too far away to contemplate. "I try not to," Jason admitted, his voice quiet. "I don't think I'm ready to imagine a life without the war. It's always been there, like an unspoken truth." Lyraketh nodded, her gaze turning inward. "I was trained to fight, to kill. It's all I've ever known. But now, I don't know. I don't know who I am without it." Jason's heart ached for her. He knew that struggle. He had felt it himself, especially in the early days of the war, when everything seemed so black and white. But over time, he had come to realize that peace didn't just mean the absence of conflict. It meant letting go of the things that defined you by the war. Letting go of the weapons, the hatred, the need to fight. It meant becoming something more than a soldier. "You're not just a weapon, Lyraketh," Jason said softly. "And you don't have to be defined by your past. You can choose something else." "I know you can." Lyraketh met his gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she looked away, as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hope, no matter how small. For the first time, she wasn't sure whether to believe him, but she couldn't dismiss the possibility either. What if he was right? What if there was a life waiting for her, one that didn't involve bloodshed? But as soon as the thought crept into her mind, it was quickly followed by doubt. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully escape the life she had known. The years of training, the brutality she had been forced to endure and dish out, the loyalty to a regime that cared little for her kind, all of it had shaped who she was. And there was still a part of her, deep down, that feared she would never be able to leave that behind. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire continued to crackle, sending sparks into the night sky, but the tension between them was palpable. Jason understood her hesitation. He understood the fear that came with trying to build a life after so much destruction. He had seen it in his fellow soldiers, those who came back from the front lines, haunted by the memories of what they had done. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," Jason said after a long pause, his voice steady but gentle. "I'm here with you, no matter what you decide. We'll take it one step at a time." Lyraketh looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see him as a human soldier or an enemy. She saw him as someone who cared for her, not for what she could do, but for who she was. And that realization, small as it was, cracked open a door in her heart she had long ago locked away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. "I don't know what comes next, but I'm glad I'm not alone." Jason smiled faintly, the weight of their journey settling on him in that moment. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. They were no longer just survivors. They were allies, partners in a fight for something more than just survival. And for the first time in a long while, Jason felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with the battlefields of war. The following days passed in a blur of survival. Jason and Lyraketh continued their journey deeper into the wilderness, avoiding patrols and living off the land. They moved cautiously, knowing that their enemies were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the more time they spent together, the more Jason realized that they had both found something in each other, a reason to keep going, even when the future seemed bleak. It wasn't just the physical survival that kept them moving. It was the shared understanding between them, the unspoken bond that had formed over time. Lyrikith, once a hardened soldier, had begun to open up more, shedding layers of the past with each passing day. She no longer spoke of her time in the Empire with bitterness, but with a quiet sadness. It was clear that she had never truly been a part of the system she had been forced to serve, and the weight of that realization was something she was only beginning to comprehend. Jason, on the other hand, had found something unexpected in Lyrikith. She was more than just a survivor of war. She was a person with dreams, with a heart that longed for peace, even if she had never allowed herself to acknowledge it before. The connection between them had shifted, evolving from mere necessity into something deeper. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to heal, in their own way, with each other's presence. One evening, as they set up camp beneath the thick canopy of trees, Lyrikith turned to Jason, her expression more serious than usual. "Do you think we can really make a difference?" she asked, her voice heavy with doubt. Jason paused in his task of starting a fire and looked up at her. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the sound of the crackling flames filled the silence. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear that came with opening herself up to hope. It wasn't an easy thing to believe in, not after everything they had both been through. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "But I believe we have to try. If we don't, then what's left? A lifetime of running, of hiding, of pretending that things can't change." Lyrikith looked away, her jaw tightening as she processed his words. "I was a part of that system," she said quietly, as if confessing a sin. "I killed for them. I followed orders. I didn't think I had a choice. But now, after everything, I don't know who I am anymore." Jason set down the stick he was using to stir the fire and stepped closer to her. He could see the pain in her face, the way her eyes searched for something, anything, that could give her a sense of purpose again. He could relate to that feeling of being lost, of wondering if you had been defined by the actions you had taken, by the things you had been forced to do. "You are not what you've done," Jason said softly, his words carrying a weight that neither of them had fully realized until now. "None of us are. What matters is what we choose to do now. We've both got a chance to make something better, something that doesn't involve killing or war." Lyrikith met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but she found none. Jason's words were genuine, spoken with the kind of honesty that she had never encountered in her years of service to the Empire. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Scared that I'll never be able to escape who I was. That I'll always be a monster in their eyes." Jason reached out, placing a hand on her arm, grounding her in the moment. "You're not a monster. You're just someone who was lost. And you're not alone anymore." The air between them felt charged, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lyrikith let his words sink in, feeling the weight of them, allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future where she didn't have to be defined by the violence she had been part of. She didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would still be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. A sudden rustling in the nearby bushes broke the moment, and both of them stiffened, instinctively reaching for their weapons. The air around them became tense, charged with the promise of danger. But then, from the shadows, a familiar voice called out, "Easy there, medic. I come in peace." Jason lowered his weapon, recognizing the voice immediately. A figure stepped into the clearing, silhouetted by the dying light of the fire. It was another human, dressed in camouflage, and looking much too casual for the situation they found themselves in. "Davis?" Jason asked, his voice filled with surprise. The figure grinned, stepping forward. "Thought I'd find you two here. Didn't think you'd be so hard to track. Always the same forest, right?" Jason shook his head in disbelief. "What are you doing here? How did you find us?" Davis smirked. "I'm not the one who's been running, Jason. But I've got information. It's not just the Zaxian Empire looking for you. There's more going on here than you realize." Jason exchanged a quick glance with Lyrikith, her face unreadable, before turning back to Davis. "What do you mean?" Davis stepped closer, his expression suddenly serious. "There's a lot more at stake than just the war between humans and Zaxians. Someone's playing both sides." The tension between them thickened, and Jason felt his heart rate spike. Whatever this was, it was bigger than he had anticipated. The storm they had been running from was just beginning. Jason's heart raced as Davis spoke, the weight of the words sinking in. It was one thing to be hunted by the Zaxian Empire. It was another to learn that there were larger forces at play, manipulating the war from the shadows. "Someone's playing both sides," Jason repeated, his voice a mix of disbelief and alarm. "Who? How do you know this?" Davis looked around cautiously, lowering his voice. "I've been monitoring the transmissions. The war has been escalating in a way that doesn't make sense, like someone wants it to keep going. Both human and Zaxian factions are being pushed into positions where peace is impossible." Lyrikith, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "If that's true, who would benefit from such chaos?" Davis hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know yet, but I've tracked some unusual communications. High-level officers from both sides are communicating in ways they shouldn't be. Someone's controlling the flow of information. And it's not just the governments. There's someone else." Jason's mind raced. He had suspected that there were larger, unseen players in the war, but hearing Davis confirm it felt like a slap in the face. It meant that everything they had believed in, everything they had been fighting for, might have been manipulated from the start. "So, what do we do?" Jason asked, his voice steely. He was used to being the one who made the decisions, but now, with this new information, he wasn't sure what the right move was anymore. Davis took a breath and met Jason's gaze, his expression serious. "We find out who's behind this. We expose them. The war won't end unless we take down the people fueling it." Lyrikith nodded slowly, her features hardening with determination. "I won't go back to being a pawn in someone else's game. If there's a chance to stop this madness, I'm in." Jason turned to her, seeing the fire in her eyes. She had come so far since their first encounter, from a soldier with no choice but to fight, to a woman willing to stand against the forces that had once controlled her life. Her words resonated deeply with him. They had both been manipulated, both pawns in a much larger game. But now, for the first time, they had the chance to take control of their own fate. "We need to find out who's pulling the strings," Jason said, his voice filled with resolve. "And we need to do it quickly. Every day we wait, more people die, more lives are ruined." Davis nodded. "I've been gathering intel. There's a place, a research facility on the outskirts of the human-controlled zone. It's heavily guarded, but I believe that's where the key is. Whoever is behind this is hiding there." Jason felt the weight of the decision settle over him. A research facility, deep within enemy territory. It was a dangerous move, but it was their best shot at uncovering the truth. It was the kind of mission that could either bring an end to the war or put them directly in the crosshairs of every faction involved. But they had no choice. "We'll need help," Jason said, glancing at Lyrikith. "We can't do this alone." "I know some people," Davis said, "but it won't be easy to get in. We'll have to move quickly, stay under the radar. The whole area's crawling with soldiers." Lyrikith's expression was unreadable, but Jason could see the resolve in her eyes. She was no longer the soldier who followed orders without question. She was a person fighting for something greater, something beyond survival, beyond the war. She was fighting for a future. "Let's do it," Lyrikith said, her voice steady. Jason nodded. "We're in this together." They spent the next few hours planning, Davis providing as much information as he could about the facility and its defenses. It was going to be a difficult operation, but Jason knew they had no choice. They couldn't keep running forever. They had to face the truth, no matter the cost. As the night grew darker, the three of them prepared to leave. each of them silently aware of the risks ahead. Jason didn't know what they would find at the research facility, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of both humanity and the Zaxians. It was a fight to stop the endless cycle of war, to put an end to the hidden forces that had been pulling the strings all along. With one final glance at the fire that had kept them warm through the night, they gathered their things and set out into the wilderness, the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. The journey ahead would be perilous, but they were no longer running from their fate. They were determined to take control, to expose the truth, and to bring an end to the war, one way or another.